Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Words on Words. My name is Iris, and I'm a graduate student in the English program here at UNR. I'm also the host of this lovely little talk show. I'm joined today by Elizabeth, who's been on the podcast before, but I'm still going to ask her to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm studying nutrition, and I have a minor in psychology.
Fun. How's that going?
It's rough.
Oh, no. So today we're talking about misconceptions about writing. So we hope to dispel some of the myths you might have, like writing is all about talent, or only bad writers need to revise, or only bad writers need to come to the writing center, things like that. Writing is such a vast, complex being that some people, I think, fear irrationally. So we're here to help dispel some of the myths and misconceptions about writing. So Elizabeth, what kind of misconceptions have you held or heard?
I think the number one thing that I see is when students come in and they say, this is awful. Like, this is my first draft. It's awful. I'm an awful writer. I just need your help. And there's a lot of things that I see wrong with that. First of all, you're probably not an awful writer. Every first draft is not, has room for improvement, right? So when people come in and say my writing's awful or I'm an awful writer, that's essentially false because you can revise and work up from there. It's just a starting point. That doesn't mean it's bad writing.
Right. And a lot of people seem to think that first draft should be perfect and that you would just your product should always be amazing and it should always come out not needing any kind of revision. And a lot of people seem to think that revision means that you're not a good writer. So I think we run into that with portfolio classes or when revision is part of a course and they're like, but there's I'm such a bad writer because I don't know how to organize this and I don't know what to do with this information and I need to add more sources or something like that. But everybody does that. Professional writers do that. That's part of the writing process. So sure, if you stop at that first draft and you're like, this is the best I can write, then it's not going to be the best it can be.
Yeah, and I think too, especially like you mentioned professional writers, there's novels out there with grammatical mistakes and spelling mistakes and typos, and so it happens to the best of us. Just because you forget a comma or you forget where to use commas, that doesn't mean you're a bad writer. Right,
and especially with punctuation, it's actually a not set in stone concept. So commas, depending on where you are, where you're writing. So I know British writers will do commas differently with quotation marks, and they'll do Oxford commas differently, and kind of depending on where you're writing, your punctuation will differ. So I think that's part of it too. Don't think you're a bad writer just because you get commas mixed up sometimes. That'd be a terrible thing to base your writing ability on.
Yeah. I think students come in too thinking that they have to have good writing for us to look at.
Oh, yeah.
They come in thinking, I was going to have so much more done before my appointment. I just lost track of time. I'm sorry, this is all I have. And I'm like, that's okay. You don't have to have good writing for me.
Yeah.
You don't have to show up with any writing. We can figure it out. I'm not grading or judging what you've brought to the table.
Right. And it's all just part of a process. And I mean, that's part of what you get to as either you get through college or you get through writing professionally, is that at some point you're going to have to turn something in. There's going to be a deadline. You're going to have to produce a product at some point. And there's always going to be room to improve. That doesn't mean that you're not the best writer you can be. That doesn't mean that you suck as a writer. That doesn't reflect on you as a writer at all. It's just there are deadlines and you have to turn something in.
Yeah, and I think something else too is a lot of people consider writing that's really candid as bad writing. A lot of people come in and say, this doesn't sound academic. This doesn't sound what my professor wants, and it may be a great creative piece, right? It's just not academic, so thus the student thinks it's awful.
Right, and that's another misconception, is that academic writing has to be boring. And I have fought tooth and nail to be able to use contractions in my writing, to have kind of hints of humor in the writing that I do. So I mean, I take it upon myself. If I get marked down, then fine. That's just a consequence I have accepted. But it doesn't have to be boring. It doesn't have to be kind of the stereotypical, I can't understand what's going on in this writing, academic writing. That's not necessary. And it's kind of on you as the student to like kind of fight back, I guess, to take it upon yourself to like have those creative pieces, or to be more colloquial, or to kind of experiment with the writing that you do, because there is no one way to write. There isn't. That's just not how it is. And if you're struggling with writing to try and fit in one of those boxes of writing style, then maybe you just need to find a different box. Just there's so many other ways to write.
Well, and I think that's kind of a problem with the way we're taught to write in elementary school and the way we're taught to write in middle school versus high school. It's always, 5-paragraph format. Start your conclusion with, in conclusion, use no contractions, like you talked about. Like, that's the way we've grown up, is writing that way. So when we get to college and we have kind of more free will, we almost think that doing anything different is going to be bad. I get students who say, like, I don't know how to write anything other than more than 5 paragraphs, because they know that structure so well, and they're like, I'm such a bad writer, that's all I know how to do. I'm like, you're not a bad writer. You're not. Right. It's just different.
Yeah. I mean, and it's not that 5-paragraph essays are bad. Like, if they're good at writing a 5-paragraph essay, like, look at you. Like, you're a good writer in this particular setting.
Yeah.
It's just that setting doesn't really apply anymore in college. So, I mean, that'd be like, let's say that you were a sprinter or something, and then all of a sudden you're now going to be asked to run a 10K. Like, they're not, they don't go well together. Yeah. Like, you can be a fantastic, like, short sprint runner. That doesn't mean that you can just hop into like a marathon and do okay. So it's the same kind of idea. You're still writing, you're still putting things on paper, you're still forming ideas, forming paragraphs, probably forming a thesis, forming introduction and conclusion. So the same elements are there with that 5-paragraph essay. It's just now you need to do different things with those paragraphs, with that introduction. So that's again kind of stopping at your first draft and saying, this is as good as I can be, this is it. So it's a stepping stone, I think, that 5-paragraph essay. And then it's like taken personally when you get to college. So if you follow that form that you've been learning since elementary school and you apply that here and you get a bad grade, you think that it's you. But it's just you need to kind of adapt and change a bit.
Expand your horizons.
Learn new things. Try new things. That's what college is about.
Yes.
Trying new writing styles.
Oh, yes.
So I guess on that note, kind of another misconception is that writing is all about talent. So if you don't have this mythical writing talent, you're just going to be a mediocre writer for the entirety of your life. And I'm pretty sure I've fallen into this misconception back in the day. But it's a matter of work and practice, as with most things.
Yeah, absolutely. I, kind of personal experience, I took AP classes in high school. The first semester I took them, I turned in my first draft, called a day on these horribly long history papers. And I barely passed the class. And then I was like, well, I must be an awful writer, right? I just don't have the writing knack. I just can't do it. I just must do better in tests or something else. And then the second semester, I was like, all right, I'm going to try harder and practice and write maybe 3 or 4 drafts of the same thing. And I ended up passing like with a 95%.
It's amazing what trying can
do.
Right?
And practice. And because I fell under that misconception too. I'm like, oh, I'm just not good at writing. Mm-hmm. Like, English isn't my thing. I'm just, math and science. But it's practice, just like you practice how to do a math problem, right, or you practice memorizing scientific concepts.
Right. And I think it's easier for people to see kind of the practice involved in math because you have like problem sets and you have like, I'm going to repeat doing something 20 times for homework. But with writing, it's a lot different because that practice is drafts. That practice is multiple papers. That practice is kind of more
lengthy.
Yeah, more lengthy, involved, in depth. Like, if you can't get good at writing 10-page papers unless you write some 10-page papers. Right. And that's going to take some time. So a lot of it is just putting that same kind of practice or effort or, I don't know, dedication maybe is the word, into writing so that you can improve, kind of using the same running metaphor. Like, you can't just expect to place first in like a turkey trot if you've been on the couch for 11 months out of that year. So right. So it's like everything else, I guess. I think it's because people maybe don't run into like kind of fancy writing as much than they would either sports or than they would with math or than they would with kind of other things where a lot of practice is involved and there's a lot of kind of emphasis on putting the hours in and doing that. Whereas writing, it's more seen, I think, as, oh, you're either good at it or you're not. And then you either just try and get through English classes or you enjoy English classes. And there's like no kind of middle space where you can just be like, I'm a fine writer. I don't want to write a novel. I don't want to be like a researcher, but I'm a fine writer.
Exactly. And I think, too, a lot of things in like classroom settings, there's so many different ways to write. Whereas like in math or other disciplines, there's maybe only one way to do something. So I think it's kind of a broader concept to wrap your head around, that maybe just because I'm not writing the same way as whoever's sitting next to me doesn't mean my writing is bad.
Oh, right. So that's yeah. So that's difficult. Like kind of what we were talking about at the beginning with having to match a certain writing style. So you're kind of left to fend for yourself.
Yeah.
So there's not like, oh, here's how you solve this kind of math problem. There's not, here's how you do this kind of experiment. It's, what do you think?
Yeah. There's no step-by-step solution.
Right. And perfectly adequate arguments or papers can appear very different. And so I think that's hard if you're not sure about yourself as a writer and you kind of look at like either your friends writing or professional writing or things like that, and you're like, I can't do that. That's probably okay. Like just spend some time and find who you are as a writer, and don't get blocked by other people like winning awards or other people getting all these A's or something like that.
Comparison to peers especially is huge. You know, in my English class, another personal experience, my first English class of college, the girl that sat right next to me, my professor asked if he could submit her for publishing.
Oh.
And that's kind of like...
You're like, oh, I'm not good.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, he didn't ask me.
Yeah.
I must be an awful writer. And that's not the case. There's not good, bad, and worse.
Yeah.
Right? Just like you were said, there's decent writers that maybe don't want to be published or don't have that dedication, but can write.
Yeah.
Because they've worked to that point.
And that's perfectly acceptable. Like, being okay is acceptable.
Being average is fine.
Being average is fine. So I guess another misconception I know that we hear a lot is that the sciences don't have to write. So if you don't like writing, you can just go into one of the sciences and just never have to write anything in your life. And that is a big misconception that holds to not be true at all.
Right. It couldn't be more far from the truth. I'm a STEM major, right? So I've taken science classes up the wazoo and done more writing for those classes, and sometimes some of my English classes, you know, lab reports and research papers and all kinds of stuff that still help me be a better writer, even though it's in the sciences.
Yeah.
So you're never gonna avoid writing
yeah.
based on the degree you pick.
And even if you continue with science into a professional career, you're still going to have funding that you need to apply for. You're still going to have to be able to write letters to, I don't know, donors, or you're still going to have to write requests for budget requests or things like that. So there's still a lot of writing even outside of just your articles, which you'll have to write those too. So there's a lot that you'll need to write. And like you're saying, there's really no way to get
away from it.
Away from writing. So if you are in a science course to get away from writing, the Writing Center is here to help you fit that bubble. Because I know a lot of people do struggle with kind of fitting into the expectations of science and kind of all that stuff.
Science writing as a whole, it's another box.
Yes.
Right? You were talking about the boxes of writing. It's a whole nother field. It's a whole nother discipline. You know, I had considered myself a decent writer until I got to these science classes, and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Absolutely no idea how to write this lab report. Right,
and you're not going to be good at the lab reports unless you write a ton of lab reports.
Right. Yeah, that was huge for me, just kind of eye-opening. Oh, there's different kinds of writing that I'm not familiar with that, okay, let me do some research on this. Let me see what other reports look like so that I can try to be the best that I can be on my first try.
Right. And revise those science reports, accept feedback, and we'll have other podcasts about science writing and professor feedback and all the good fun stuff. But I guess what I would like students to keep in mind, and I need to remind myself this sometimes, is that it's all just practice. All of writing is practice. You cannot expect your first draft to be perfect. You cannot expect your sixth draft to be perfect. You cannot expect the draft you turn in to be perfect. Even like 20 years down the line, if all you do is writing, there's still going to be things to change, things to reorganize, different ways you can say things. And I think maybe we get stuck on seeing one of those ways to write as better. And if we can't achieve kind of that quote unquote better writing, then we're not good writers. But that's not the case at all.
Yeah, I think something else like for students to keep in mind is that you don't compare yourself to other writers. That's something that I get stuck in all the time, is thinking, oh wow, like they're an awesome writer and I'm just sitting here mediocre. But you don't compare yourself to them, because it's not that they're better or worse than you, they're just a different writer. No one's, it's not on the scale of 1 to 10, good to bad.
Yeah.
It's, oh, she writes in the creative box, he writes in the science box. There's no, you can't compare yourself. It's not math, right?
Yeah.
Where there's one solution that you can compare yourself. I'm not saying you should do that, but it's just so much more than that.
And on that note, we'll go ahead and bring this podcast to a close. I'd like to thank Elizabeth for joining me today and you, our listener, for tuning in. And we hope you'll join us next time.